October 25th, 1944. The Philippine Sea boiled with smoke and steel. The sun hadn't yet burned through the mist when lookouts aboard the American escort carrier Fanshawe Bay saw something on the horizon. Dark shapes, too big, too fast. Moments later, the sea erupted in orange fire. They weren't supposed to be here. The Japanese fleet, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had slipped through the chaos of Leyte Gulf and now bore down on a small American task unit known as Taffy 3. On the U.S. side, 6 tiny escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. It wasn't even a fair fight. The Americans had been told this was a quiet patrol, a support mission. Their thin-skinned ships carried planes armed with depth charges and light bombs, not the heavy weapons needed to stop a fleet of giants. But when the horizon filled with shells and the ocean began to rain fire, the captains of those little destroyers didn't run. They turned toward the enemy. Because sometimes history doesn't belong to those who are strongest. It belongs to those who refuse to back down, even when they're certain they won't come home. Stay with me as we return to the morning when America's smallest ships took on Japan's mightiest fleet and won the impossible. October 20th, 1944. The invasion of Leyte began. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, stepping ashore as cameras rolled and thunder echoed from the beaches. Behind him, the U.S. Navy unleashed the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. Waves of landing craft poured men and tanks onto the coast, and hundreds of ships filled the horizon in a steel wall of power. America was taking the Philippines back, and Japan was about to fight for its life. But deep within Tokyo's naval command, Admiral Toyoda Somo had already put in motion a desperate plan. Operation Shogo 1, the last great gamble of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The plan was madness, to send Japan's remaining battleships and cruisers into a 3-pronged assault that would crush the American landing force. If it worked, the U.S. would lose its beachhead, its fleet, and perhaps the war's momentum. If it failed, Japan's navy would be finished. The centerpiece of the attack was the center force, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It was the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled. The super battleship Yamato, her sister ship Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, and more than a dozen destroyers. They would push through the sea beyond sea, strike east through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the unprotected escort carriers supporting MacArthur's troops. By October 23rd, American submarines USS Darter and USS Dace spotted Kurita's fleet off Palawan Island. In a blistering attack, they sank 2 heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship Atago, and damaged 2 others. Kurita barely escaped with his life, pulling from the water as oil fires burned around him. But instead of retreating, he pressed on, shaken, furious, determined to fulfill his orders. That same night, far to the south, another Japanese force under Admiral Nishimura was annihilated at the Battle of Surigao Strait, where American battleships crossed the T and turned the water into fire. The Japanese southern force was gone, but Kurita's central force was still coming. October 24th, 1944. As Kurita's ships entered the sea beyond sea, American carrier aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 struck with wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers. For hours, the sky was alive with the sound of engines and the flash of anti-aircraft fire. Bombs tore through the Musashi, the largest battleship ever built, sending up geysers of steam and flame. By sunset, she rolled over and sank beneath the waves, a mountain of steel disappearing into the dark. Everyone assumed the Japanese had been stopped. American pilots reported Kurita retreating westward, his fleet broken and scattered. Admiral Halsey took the bait, racing north with his fast carriers to attack a Japanese decoy force. But Kurita hadn't turned back. Under cover of darkness, he regrouped his surviving ships and turned east again, slipping silently through the San Bernardino Strait. The sea was calm. No one was watching. By dawn on October 25th, Kurita's force emerged into the Philippine Sea, directly behind the lightly armed task unit April 3rd, 77, known as Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. His task group consisted of just 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, Kitcun Bay, Gamber Bay, and St. Lo, protected by only 3 destroyers: Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. They were designed for anti-submarine work, not for naval combat. When the first lookout aboard Fanshawe Bay saw massive gun flashes on the horizon, no one believed it. The Japanese shouldn't have been there. But seconds later, 14-inch shells from the Yamato began to fall around them, pillars of water rising hundreds of feet into the air. Sprague's ships were caught broadside, completely exposed. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and already within range of some of the largest naval guns ever built. The sky filled with the scream of incoming shells, and the calm morning sea turned to boiling chaos. Sprague had no choice but to do the unthinkable: order his tiny ships to attack. "Small boys, attack," came the command over the radio. And in that moment, a handful of destroyer captains, knowing they faced certain death, turned their ships toward the enemy's guns. Because sometimes, courage isn't about victory. It's about turning into the fire when every instinct tells you to run. October 25, 1944, dawn broke in smoke and fire. The men of Taffy 3 had woken to what they thought would be another routine day of providing air support to MacArthur's landings at Leyte. Instead, the horizon was filled with the black silhouettes of Japanese battleships. The ocean shook as the first salvos roared toward them, shells the size of small cars plunging into the water, sending columns of spray higher than their masts. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague stood on the bridge of his flagship Fanshawe Bay, staring into disbelief. Through the haze, he could make out the massive form of Yamato, her main guns thundering, each broadside like the anger of the sea itself. Around her, cruisers and destroyers advanced in perfect formation. The entire Japanese center force, more than 20 ships, had appeared out of the morning fog like ghosts. Sprague's mind raced. His task group wasn't built to fight a surface battle. The escort carriers, nicknamed Jeep carriers, were slow, barely 18 knots, and carried aircraft armed for ground attack, not naval duels. His destroyers were light and thinly armored. Against battleships, they were suicide craft, but there was no time to think. His men were already dying. "Open fire. Smoke screen, all ships," Sprague ordered. Within seconds, the small destroyers began to pump thick white smoke across the sea, trying to hide the carriers from the advancing giants. Then came the most impossible command. Destroyers commenced torpedo attack. Commander Ernest E. Evans, captain of the destroyer USS Johnston, heard the order and didn't hesitate. He had told his crew the day before, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Now, with Japanese shells screaming overhead, he made good on that promise. He turned the Johnston directly toward the enemy, one tiny destroyer against an entire fleet. The ship's engines howled as it surged forward, cutting through the smoke, closing the distance to less than 10,000 yards from battleships that towered over it like fortresses. Shells tore through the water. One 14-inch round smashed into the Johnston's forward gun mount, killing men instantly and blowing holes through her hull. Still, she charged on. "Fire torpedoes!" Evans shouted. 5 silver streaks launched from her tubes and raced toward a massive cruiser. Seconds later, explosions rocked the horizon. Kumano's bow blew apart in a thunderous burst. The giant Japanese ship veered out of formation, bleeding fire and oil. But the Johnston had been marked. The cruisers Chokai and Haguro trained their guns and unleashed a storm of shells. The Johnston was hit again and again, her decks on fire, her guns still blazing. Yet Evans refused to turn back. He steered through smoke and chaos, firing until his ammunition ran dry. Behind him, the destroyer Hull made her own run. Captain Leon S. Kentberger pushed his ship into the line of fire, dodging shells as she laid down her torpedoes. Every hit she took seemed to drive her forward, not stop her. When her steering failed and her guns jammed, Kentberger gave the only order left: keep firing until she sinks. Moments later, Hull disappeared under the waves, taking most of her crew with her. The Heermann, the last destroyer still able to fight, followed next. She zigzagged through the storm, launching torpedoes that sent two Japanese cruisers fleeing in confusion. For the first time, the enemy began to falter. Overhead, American pilots scrambled from the carriers. They had no armor-piercing bombs, only depth charges and small explosives, but they attacked anyway. Plane after plane dove through anti-aircraft fire, pelting the Japanese ships with anything they could carry. Some even made dry runs without ammunition, hoping to distract the gunners. One pilot radioed, "We're all out of bombs, but we'll keep making passes. Maybe we'll scare them." And somehow it worked. To the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kurita, the chaotic American defense seemed far larger than it was. Smoke, torpedo wakes, and constant air attacks made him believe he had stumbled into the main U.S. carrier fleet, not a small escort group. He hesitated. He had already lost ships. His formation was scattered. His charts were incomplete. He could not see the full picture through the smoke. Then a report came in. A U.S. torpedo had nearly hit Yamato. Kurita's instinct screamed that he was walking into a trap. So, at 9:20 a.m., with victory seemingly within reach, he gave the order that stunned his officers. All ships, turn north. Disengage. The Japanese fleet, battered and confused, began to retreat. On the sea behind them, the cost of the American stand was everywhere. The hull was gone. The Johnston lay dead in the water, still firing until her guns fell silent. The Heermann limped away, her decks shredded. On the carriers, wounded men dragged their brothers from burning hangars as planes crash-landed onto smoldering decks. Yet, against all reason, the tiny American force had survived and turned back the largest surface fleet Japan would ever send to sea. It was a miracle built on defiance. When survivors of the Johnston were pulled from the waves, one sailor was asked how they'd managed to fight so hard against impossible odds. He just said, "We didn't think about winning. We just thought about not letting the others down." October 25th, 1944, late morning, the sea burned with smoke and memory. The battle off Samar was not over yet. The destroyers lay crippled or sinking, the air thick with cordite and the acrid smell of burning fuel. Men floated in the water among twisted steel, oil slicks, and debris, watching the horizon for another salvo that never came. The great Japanese fleet, Yamato, Nagato, and the cruisers that had torn them apart, was turning away. Against every law of logic, the small ships of Taffy III had survived. But victory had its price. The USS Johnston was gone. Her captain, Ernest Evans, last seen standing on the shattered deck, his hands still on the helm as the ship slipped beneath the waves. The whole had vanished into the smoke. The Heermann, barely afloat, listed badly, her hull pierced through and through. The sky above was streaked with black trails of oil fires drifting toward the heavens like ghosts. On the carriers, chaos still reigned. The Kalinin Bay was holed in several places. The White Plains had narrowly avoided destruction when a Japanese shell passed through her without detonating. But worst of all, one ship, the USS Gambier Bay, was already gone. Caught in the open by cruiser fire, she had been pounded relentlessly until she capsized, her hull disappearing beneath waves churned red and black. Survivors clung to rafts as the Japanese guns turned away. At 10 a.m., as the last echoes of battle faded, something strange filled the air, a silence that no one could understand. The men on deck looked at each other, unsure if they were still alive, unsure if they had truly driven off the enemy, or if it was just a pause before the end. Then, out of the morning haze came another sound, the whine of engines, but not American. A formation of aircraft appeared high above the carriers, descending fast. Some crewmen cheered, thinking their own planes were returning. But within seconds they realized the truth. The planes were Japanese. In the chaos of retreat, a new kind of weapon had arrived at the war, one that defied reason and rewrote the rules of combat. They were kamikazes, pilots who would crash their planes directly into American ships, turning themselves into human bombs. No one on Taffy 3 had ever seen such a thing before. At 10:53 a.m., the first kamikaze came screaming down toward the USS St. Lo. The ship's anti-aircraft guns opened up in a desperate curtain of fire, tracers streaking upward. The plane wobbled, but did not break off. It plunged straight through the gunfire, smashing into the deck near the aft elevator. The explosion ripped through the hangar, igniting fully fueled aircraft and detonating stored bombs. Within seconds, this St. Lo was a tower of flame. Black smoke poured from her sides as men ran through fire, trying to save their ship. Below deck, secondary explosions tore open her hull. One final blast sent her elevator flying hundreds of feet into the air, and then, in one terrible moment, the carrier rolled on her side and vanished beneath the sea. She was the first major U.S. ship to be sunk by a kamikaze attack. For the survivors floating in the water nearby, it was like watching the sky itself fall. Men who had already faced the guns of the Yamato now stared at a new enemy, one they could not see coming, one that could strike from above and vanish in a flash. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Sprague watched in grim silence. His task unit had lost 2 destroyers, 1 carrier, and hundreds of men. Yet, by all logic, they had survived something that should have destroyed them all. The Japanese fleet was retreating north, still firing sporadically but pulling away fast. Confusion reigned on their side, too. Conflicting orders, fuel shortages, and the belief that Halsey's main fleet was about to fall on them. They did not know that Halsey had taken the bait to the north, leaving Taffy 3 alone. It was luck. It was confusion. It was miscommunication. But it was also courage, the kind that defied reason. By noon, the battle was over. The ocean was littered with wreckage and the bodies of men who had given everything they had. Survivors clung to debris as rescue ships worked frantically to pull them out of the water. The cries of the wounded carried across the waves, the voices of men who had fought the impossible fight and somehow lived to tell it. One gunner aboard Kalinin Bay wrote later, "I could still hear the sea boiling from all the shells like it was alive and angry." Another man, rescued after hours adrift, said simply, "They left us for dead. We showed them what dead men can do." When Admiral Sprague sent his final report that afternoon, it was written with a steady hand but a heavy heart. This will stand as an example of what courage and devotion to duty can achieve when gallantry meets impossible odds. He was right. The battle off Samar would go down in history as the greatest upset in naval warfare, a moment when small ships and ordinary men faced the impossible and won through sheer will. But for the men in the water, there was no glory, only exhaustion. They floated beneath a blazing sun, surrounded by oil and wreckage, waiting for rescue that would take hours, sometimes days. For some, help would never come. The sea that had carried them in a battle now carried their silence, the kind of silence only heroes leave behind. October 25th, 1944. Afternoon settled over the Philippine Sea like a dying ember. The guns had fallen silent, the thunder of explosions replaced by the hiss of waves licking twisted steel. The horizon was smeared with oil and flame. The sea itself turned black as ink. The battle was over, but the suffering had only begun. Hundreds of sailors clung to debris in the churning water. Some were burned, some bleeding, many coated head to toe in thick oil that made it almost impossible to breathe. The ocean was alive with the ghosts of the battle. Drifting lifeboats, shattered planks, helmets, ammunition boxes, and the faint cries of men calling out for ships that would never come. "Anyone out there?" a voice shouted. A faint answer came from somewhere far off, weak, barely human. "Here. Help here." The USS Johnston had gone down hours earlier. Captain Ernest Evans was gone, last seen shirtless and bloodied, still shouting orders as a ship rolled under. The Hole and Gamber Bay were gone too. Men from those ships now floated together in clusters, trying to stay alive as the tropical sun bore down and the oil burned their eyes. Every hour felt like a lifetime. Sharks, drawn by blood and wreckage, began circling. The wounded prayed in whispers, clutching onto rafts that groaned with every wave. But even in that Black Sea, courage refused to sink. On the Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Sprague was still coordinating what remained of his fleet. He had ships that could barely move, decks torn open by shell fire, anti-aircraft guns jammed from the constant firing. The Kalinin Bay limped along, her hull riddled with holes but still afloat. Her crew, exhausted, blistered, deafened, refused to leave their posts. Sprague looked out across the smoke-filled horizon. "We fought a fleet we weren't supposed to survive," he murmured. "And we're still here." The radio crackled. Reports of Japanese withdrawal, ships sighted heading north, battered and burning. The Yamato, the pride of Japan, had retreated without ever firing her final barrage. The Americans, against all logic, had stopped them cold. Yet victory tasted like ashes. Far away, aboard the retreating Yamato, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on his bridge, face unreadable. His officers were furious, confused, and humiliated. They had faced what they believed was a major U.S. carrier group, only to later learn they had been fighting tiny escort carriers and destroyers. One officer demanded to know why they had turned back. Kurita gave no answer. He only looked out at the burning sea and muttered, "The gods were not with us today." For Japan, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was the last time the Imperial Navy's battleships would ever take the offensive. The spirit of Yamato, the pride of their empire, had been broken not by superior firepower, but by sheer audacity. Back among the American wreckage, rescue efforts stretched into the night. The USS Dennis and USS Raymond, small ships that had survived, began searching the dark waters with searchlights, pulling men from the oil slicks. Many were half dead, whispering thanks as hands reached down to drag them aboard. Others weren't so lucky. Entire clusters of survivors had drifted beyond reach, carried by the current. Some men hallucinated that rescue ships were near and swam toward the horizon, never to be seen again. An ensign from the Gambier Bay later wrote in his journal, "We thought the battle was the end. We didn't know the real test began after it." He described hours of clinging to wreckage, hearing the moans of his friends fade one by one as the night grew colder. Some sang to stay awake. Others prayed. A few simply stared up at the stars, whispering names of home. When dawn came, the ocean was littered with bodies. Rescue ships continued to search, pulling men aboard one by one. For some, it was too late, but for others, it was salvation. One survivor, eyes sunken and skin burned, asked his rescuer, "Did we win?" The sailor helping him smiled weakly. "You're here, aren't you?" "Yeah, we won." By the end of that day, word of the battle had reached the rest of the fleet. Reports poured in. For American ships lost, several badly damaged, but Japan's central force had been turned back. An impossible defense had saved thousands of lives and secured the success of the Leyte landings. The victory was almost unbelievable. Tiny destroyers had charged battleships. Pilots had attacked without ammunition. Crews had fought until their decks burned beneath them. And somehow, impossibly, they had prevailed. The Navy began calling it the battle that should never have been won. The men who fought it would call it something simpler, Samar. But even as the world began to realize what had happened, the survivors who floated through that long night would never forget the screams, the smoke, and the silence that followed. Their courage had rewritten history, and their sacrifice had cost them everything. October 26th, 1944, the morning after the storm. The sun rose pale and merciless over a sea that still smelled of death. The waves carried quiet now, not the roar of guns, but the soft creak of drifting wreckage. Everywhere, traces of the impossible battle remained. Life vests, floating helmets, torn life rafts, and the haunting stillness of men who had fought until they could fight no more. American rescue ships combed the area from dawn to dusk. USS Dennis, USS Raymond, and USS Dashing Wave zigzagged through the oil-slicked waters, scanning for movement, listening for faint cries. They found men half delirious from dehydration, covered in burns, their skin raw from salt and oil. Some had been in the water for over 24 hours. When the first survivors were brought aboard, many wept silently, not from pain, but but from disbelief. They had survived the most one-sided sea battle imaginable. A young sailor from Hull kept repeating one phrase as they lifted him from the raft. They shouldn't have turned back. They shouldn't have turned back. His rescuer placed a hand on his shoulder. No, son. They did. Because of you. Back aboard the surviving carriers. Fanshawe Bay, Cullinan Bay, and White Plains. Damage control crews worked tirelessly. Fires were still being fought below decks. Ammunition was being dumped overboard to prevent new explosions, and chaplains moved silently through the wounded, offering comfort where medicine could not. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague sat alone for a moment on the bridge, staring out at the horizon. His ships were battered, their decks scarred and twisted, but they were still afloat. That fact alone defied every principle of naval warfare. He wrote in his logbook, "Enemy losses are uncertain. Our losses are heavy. Yet the outcome is clear. They withdrew. The small boys of Taffy 3 have done the impossible." News of the battle spread like wildfire through the American fleet. At Ulithi Atoll, sailors gathered around radios, stunned into silence as the reports came in. Destroyers charged battleships. Escort carriers survived direct hits. Japanese fleet turned back. At first, no one believed it. It sounded like a fairy tale told at sea. Until the wounded began to arrive, their stories carried on stretchers and whispered across decks. They came out of smoke, shells falling everywhere, one gunner said. "We thought we were finished." But the skipper just said, "Then let's go down fighting." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the reaction was very different. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita returned to Japan in silence. His fleet shattered and morale broken. The Imperial Navy had suffered a psychological defeat it could never undo. The Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato, symbols of Japan's naval pride, had been outmaneuvered by small, thin-hulled American ships. Kurita's superiors demanded an explanation. Why had he retreated? Why had he abandoned victory at the doorstep? Kurita gave the same quiet answer every time. Because I no longer knew what I was facing. The truth was even simpler. He had faced men who refused to yield, and in that defiance, he saw something he could not defeat. In Washington, the reports from Leyte reached high command within days. Admirals read them twice, then again, unable to believe what had happened. The official communiques used restrained language, but among the officers, one phrase spread in whispers. Taffy 3 saved the invasion. Had Kurita broken through, he could have destroyed MacArthur's landing fleet. Hundreds of transports, tens of thousands of men. The invasion of the Philippines could have turned into a slaughter. But because a handful of destroyers and escort carriers stood their ground, the Japanese plan collapsed. That day, courage had changed the course of the Pacific War. As the survivors reached hospital ships, they were met with quiet awe. Nurses and doctors listened in disbelief as wounded men described charging battleships with 5-inch guns or pilots attacking with no ammunition left, diving only to distract the enemy. One pilot said softly, "We didn't think we'd make it back. We just didn't want them to get through." Another whispered, "I didn't feel brave. I just didn't want to die doing nothing." Those words became the heart of what would later be called the spirit of Taffy 3. In the weeks that followed, medals were awarded, names written into history. But among the men who survived, it wasn't the honors they remembered. It was the faces of the ones who didn't make it back. A sailor aboard the Cullinan Bay wrote home, "I keep seeing Captain Evans standing there, calm as the world fell apart around him. We didn't just follow him, we believed in him. That's what saved us." Ernest E. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American officer in U.S. Navy history to receive it. His ship, USS Johnston, lay somewhere beneath the waves, silent but undefeated. The ocean had swallowed many that day, but it had also given birth to a legend that said, even when the enemy has the numbers, the firepower, the strength, courage can still turn the tide. October 26, 1944. Evening fell quietly across the sea that had witnessed the impossible. The sun sank behind the horizon, painting the waves blood red, as if the ocean itself remembered. Rescue ships still moved slowly through the oil and wreckage, lanterns glowing like tiny stars in the dark. The storm of battle was long gone, but the echoes, the roar of guns, the screams, the courage would never fade. The surviving sailors of Taffy 3 sat on the decks of rescue ships, wrapped in blankets, staring into the distance. Some spoke softly. Others just sat in silence, haunted by the faces of friends who had gone under with their ships. One man from Hull whispered to no one in particular, "I keep hearing the guns. Every time the waves hit, I think they're still firing." Another, from Johnston, held a torn piece of deck plating in his lap like a relic. "We didn't lose," he said. "We just ran out of ship." In the days that followed, the Navy began to piece together what had really happened off Samar. When the official reports came in, they sounded almost unreal. 3 destroyers and 4 escort carriers had held off an entire Japanese fleet, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans had been outnumbered 6-1, outgunned 10-1, and yet they had turned the enemy away. Historians would later call it the most heroic action in modern naval history. But for the men who were there, it was never about glory, it was about duty. Rear Admiral Sprague, in his final report, wrote words that would echo across generations. The conduct of these officers and men was beyond all praise. They fought with such gallantry and devotion that I can only conclude they were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for each other. Thousands of miles away, in small towns across America, telegrams began to arrive. Families wept quietly on doorsteps as neighbors gathered in silence. Most had never even heard of the place where their sons had died. But those who returned home told stories that carried the weight of legends, of ships charging battleships, of men fighting without fear, of courage that defied logic. A pilot who had survived said years later, "When people call us heroes, I tell them, no, we were scared, but we didn't run. That's what matters." Decades passed. The world moved on. The ocean reclaimed its secrets. But the memory of Samar refused to die. In 2019, explorers found the wreck of the USS Johnston, resting nearly 21,000 feet below the surface, deeper than any warship ever discovered. The footage showed her guns still aimed forward, as if waiting for orders. Her hull was torn, her deck shattered, but her spirit untouched. The name Johnston glowed faintly under the deep-sea lights, a silent monument to the day courage met destiny. Survivors who were still alive wept when they saw the images. "It's like she's still fighting," one said, voice trembling. Another whispered, "The ocean kept her safe all these years." The discovery reignited memories, not just of loss, but of pride. For a moment, the men of Taffy 3 lived again in the minds of those who watched. Young, fearless, charging into the smoke. The battle off Samar was more than a victory. It was proof that in the darkest moments, when logic says surrender and fear says run, courage can still rewrite the ending. It was a story not of power, but of heart. Not of might, but of will. Not of survival, but of sacrifice. The men of Taffy 3 didn't fight for medals or headlines. They fought so others could live, so freedom could stand. Their courage deserves to be remembered, not just as history, but as a reminder of what bravery truly means.